All right, so welcome to the Digital Disruption Webcast for 2020. This is going to be a webcast series that actually breaks down how your business needs to deal with the changes, the massive changes that we are facing as a society, and more importantly, as your business, whether you're B2B or B2C. This webcast is going to be a free, complete for you to use. Lots of data packed in here, but we will also have several chapters available after this, so make sure and stay tuned on foodabletv.com. And if you're not over there, subscribe so that you can get information about these great webcasts. Today's webcast is going to be talking about the decade that is starting in 2020, which will be the most profound period of time ever recorded as we venture into the unsure waters of the perfect storm of politics, technology, consumer privacy, the mainstream media implosion, remapping of our global food system, and the move to globalism. This is the reason we will see a major disruption in the next decade. I pulled a slide today right from broadcast, or I should say streaming news. This is from a streaming platform, which kind of indicates a little bit about what's happening in media today, is that we get our news off of apps and streaming services more so than broadcast or even cable in some cases, which says a lot to the cord cutter community, which is really kind of the basis of what's happening in general. But right here you've got Mark Zuckerberg, who is on Capitol Hill literally as just yesterday, as we roll this webcast, talking about the digital challenges that face the spectrum. Really kind of debuted. Obviously, this is, I think, going to be the kickoff into what I think is going to be the decade of disruption and what all that's going to affect. So this is, I just thought, a perfect example of what is happening in our society today and how this is going to be affecting your business. So let's get into kind of one of the elements that has kind of set the tone for what's happening in the next decade over this past 5 years. And that has been around influencers. Now, influencers have kind of controlled the conversation. They have been the guiding force of conversation over the past 5 years. I have a feeling that we are going to start see less and less in the influencer community with things that are happening on Instagram, Facebook, and just in general. I think this is going to go back to not necessarily the masses, but I don't know that we're going to see a scenario where the influencers are controlling the conversation as much as they have been in the past. And I want to break down into some of the examples here that you see on the slides. And this is what controlled the conversation as far back as 2016. And we'll break down a few of the points here. Social media use was at 47%. Mobile streaming was penetration only at 9%. Web use, fairly high. You know, a lot of people were still using kind of in that era, being 2016, the app ecosystem was being built. So I feel like apps were really a big part of that. But web use, 72%. Email use was still very powerful in 2016 at 91%. High bandwidth mobile devices only at 21% in 2016. And news apps just didn't exist. So when you think about where that was just a short few years ago and where we are this year, and what you see here on the slides are what's controlling the conversation today, right here in 2019. We'll look at 2020 in a second. Social media use at 51%, so somewhat flatlining. We're not seeing the massive growth in social media usage. I think now we're going to be seeing new entries coming into the market because I think critical mass has already hit. Obviously, we've seen the lower platform engagements from Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, all the majors. So now it's really about kind of that new audience that's coming into the market, being Gen Z. Mobile streaming penetration, 73%. This is the cord cutter community. This is where the major battlefront will be fought in the coming decade. Web use, 68%, slightly lower. Again, I think that's happening because content is being consumed in ways that are outside the typical web as we know it. So if you look at just Netflix and you look at Amazon Prime, these are app-based products that are very domain-driven. which I think is going to control a lot of the share of mind as we get ready for the coming decade. Email, 72%, high bandwidth mobile. Now we're at critical mass, literally in a matter of just a few years. Every person almost that's walking around that is earning income out there that could potentially be your customer is at 93% penetration. So this is high bandwidth mobile, and we haven't even hit 5G yet. So when that occurs, we could see a massive shift in the technology that mobile devices are going to be able to afford us. News app usage, 39%. So out of nowhere, we're almost at 40% of the population that's using news apps now from the likes of Apple News and Google News. All right, so let's look at the next slide here. And this is going to be talking about where professionals use, kind of their use of digital media for education and information. So if you're B2B, or even if you're B2C, in some cases, this is going to be a platform, because in many cases what you're dealing with in a B2C application is you're trying to educate, maybe you're a new restaurant brand or maybe a new service company. You're trying to educate your guests or your consumers, and these are going to be some of the things that you're going to be facing in 2020. So 67% will not read print. And what I mean by that is magazines, newspapers. We have all seen the kind of the death of that media go away. It's one that I have been looking at for years and saying this is not where our future is holding us. We will definitely see a huge downturn in where print is moving. 83% will use mobile over desktop. Now this is another massive shift towards behavior, and behavior is the number one thing that you have to be observing right now in your business on a day in, day out basis to be able to understand how to go to the next level and to deal with this disruption that's going to be occurring. 63% of key decision makers now are under the age of 40. Huge big difference, because those in 2016 were not decision makers. 3, 4, 5 years later, they are now decision makers, and they're taking up one of the largest categories in terms of B2B and B2C decision making out there. So under 40 is a major demographic for the future, being the next 10 years. YouTube leads as the most used social app. YouTube is by far surpassing now usage and engagement over all the majors, including Facebook, and including, this again is going back to the idea of why YouTube is there. In essence, it's I think YouTube is one of the best education platforms that's on the planet today, just because of the format. Now, because of audio and what's happening in the audio renaissance that's occurring, YouTube has that ability to also become a destination for things like podcasts. And if you look at someone like a Joe Rogan podcast, I mean, he's doing that on YouTube, and most of the consumption of his podcast, though you can find it on every podcast player out there, is done on YouTube. And he's just sitting at a desk, interviewing guests. But the element of video and audio, being able to have that flexibility, YouTube is going to continue to be huge. Video consumption is at its highest ever, 87%. Podcast use rises to 82%. This is another big one that I think is going to really play out in the next few years. Audio is here to stay, and terrestrial radio may be on its way, finally on its way out. As we know it, I think radio will change and become more RSS and or streaming type products, but in terms of what you've seen in terrestrial radio over the past decade, I think that's gone. 27% drop in Facebook use. This is a big deal especially when you look at the professional aspect, and if you're a B2B, 27% drop in Facebook next year by the end of 2020. With all of the things that Facebook is facing in terms, especially if we deal with some scenarios in the upcoming election in 2020, Facebook could really be in a big heap of trouble. And that's both on an engagement standpoint. Of course, we'll see if people stop advertising there still, because they are still the 800-pound gorilla in terms of total audience. 69% of independents and chefs, now we go into the food service space, are seeking local engagement and content, and that I think is going to be a factor in how brands and companies that are trying to reach audiences like that, small business owners in the future, will be done more on a localized level. And then 53% are using on-demand platforms. This is another major move for education, and I think both Netflix, the likes of Amazon, YouTube, etc., are going to be major players in how you move forward. We're going to talk about all these things today in the podcast. This next slide is really kind of a guide for you as a business, whether you're in a B2C or a B2B business, of how you should be looking at a strategic content model that's shifting kind of this overall influence. And there's, as you can see here, there's 6 little components that we go into. One is the content origination. So much like what we're doing right here today, a webcast that's going to be broadcasted out on a platform to you, and then have all sorts of engagement products and elements that will follow this. You probably learned of this through email or maybe social media or on Facebook or on YouTube and signed up in one of those formats. So that is a huge step in how you're developing your content origination and how you select the platforms that you're going to use to get your content out there. The next is authenticity affirmation. So that's, again, playing on the idea is that you really need to become very authentic. And this is a scenario in which you have to really kind of break down the barriers of, that corporate speak and really get back to the core of what you're trying to do as a business, and that's help other people. If you're in business and you're trying to help other businesses, or you're in business and you're trying to go to a guest, this is where your authenticity has to, essentially transact. You've got to do it in the edge of your content. Your content cannot look commercialized. It needs to have that personalized feeling. The next element is kind of how do you start to mold into this influence funnel? Remember I talked about earlier in the webcast is that influencers may be kind of dissolving. What I think will happen is we'll see an influence funnel. Now that will be a group. One influencer may be a power player for you and your business on one week, and the next week they're not. So you've got to learn how to get into an overall funnel and be able to utilize influence and influencers to be able to project your content. And then getting into a replication model. Being able to scale your business, and we'll talk about why content marketing is going to be the way to go for you in the next decade. And then, and of course, staying on a replication model, being just keeping consistent on delivery and content replication is a huge factor, which I think is one of the biggest things that a lot of businesses don't do today is they just can't keep up or keep pace. So that's where you hire companies like ourselves that would be able to help you and be able to get to that level to keep consistency rolling out and moving. Then you get into amplification. This is where it gets really dicey. We're going to go into this in depth. And then what to do with market impact, meaning how do you deal with whether it's success or failure. These all have to be looked at. The next element is what I call the influence wave, and this really starts with your content strategy creation and kind of your process. What's your model of how you go about bringing products or content to market? One of the things that you are going to have to address is you're going to go back into SEO, but also the algorithms in search that are being applied are going to become very important. And this is happening more so in news today, meaning someone like an Apple News. So your content is going to have to kind of flex around some of what these algorithms are doing to be able to surface, to get up on the top pages or come up in a lot of people's feeds. And that's going to be a major factor. Content transport, shareable and consumable. This again is going to be all about selecting the right platform. Content megaphone. This is going to be key placement to certain types of users that are also leveraging the algorithms on these influencers to be able to really kind of get your message out there. And then content pickup. This is where people are actually, they're resonating with it, that you've actually reached the person you're trying to reach. And then now the impact, which is most of all, this is where it occurs on the purchase path and kind of that next step in being able to say, okay, we've reached them, we've done all these things. We're finally at that point. If you don't have the infrastructure or the systems in place to be able to engage, then you've kind of done a ton of work, unless you're looking at brand awareness, for nothing at all. So let's talk about a case study here on a company, Beyond Meat. This is a very interesting one because Beyond Meat, when this was occurring, this model, their 2018, this is pre-IPO, they essentially went out and looked at a platform to be able to target influencers, chefs, and brands primarily. So they zeroed in on a certain demographic. They increased their conversation over 422% year over year. They increased their brand sentiment 8.7 points, and they led the plant-based protein companies out there by Q1 of 2019, which was perfect timing for their IPO, which occurred just this year, and of course outpacing their competitors by 22% in engagement. So this company essentially was prepping an entire movement into plant-based, and they had all these products probably already queued up, ready to go. So as soon as the IPO trigger hit, those products started dropping like sneakers and new albums. I mean, this is a company that was well prepared for doing exactly what I just talked about, of dealing with their content. Their content was products and then amplifying those products out there at the right time, which ended up being a huge win for Beyond Meat. And if you think about what that can mean to your business, if you're strategically prepping for product launch, maybe a new location if you're a retailer or a consumer brand, or maybe you've got a new service that you're offering. These kinds of strategies that you put in place along the way, and then aligning those with something in terms of content marketing, messaging, and et cetera, is really where all this starts to pay off. Because this is where I think the system has kind of fell down in the sense of where PR has kind of failed us, is that there's so many outlets now that there's no pure play on, I can penetrate YouTube, I can penetrate blogs or websites, I can penetrate social media. That is becoming much more difficult. So the strategies that Beyond Meat used was a blanket effect, but with very specific content that was dialed into that platform and then dialed into that particular influencer. So if you look here, chefs and menu influence, 14% on total conversations, but look at the key consumer. So this was an interesting one. 16% of their conversation came from key consumers. So what their strategy was pull through. They wanted to get enough information out to the consumer to be able to affect. And if you look at key influencers and key super influencers, again, they're really going after, when you look at the overall on this slide, the overall brands and chef and menu influence was only 20%. The rest of it was key influencer or key consumer. So they really went after the pull-through strategy effect. And this is a very powerful way to go to market with a product, is getting out there to it. And now you have the capability of doing that if you're taking the right steps in preparing. So, we've talked about kind of this disruption component. Now we're going to break down into really kind of the food service portion of this webcast, and this is talking about where consumption is being done. We study food service, but it also applies to a lot of other business aspects or categories out there. But in this particular case, we're going to look at food service media consumption to give you an example of how much movement is occurring here. And of course, we do this through a platform we call Foodable Labs. Foodable Labs is essentially, we started about 10 years ago, a little over 10 years ago, developing basically some step logic systems that analyze keyword tracking and certain types of brand indices, meaning a Starbucks was an entity and a Panera Bread was an entity, but there might be, X number thousand of individuals that fall underneath that brand entity, or X number of units and locations. All that has been done and indexed in Foodable Labs over the years, and we've continued to build on that. We've changed our model with Foodable Labs a bit so that we're not tracking necessarily as much data. Now we're really honing in on very core, critical target data that is very specific to products and services. And we do this across the social platforms and digital platforms that you see right here on screen. And these are some interesting ones because they're not the same ones that you've seen for the last maybe 5 years. There's a lot that are missing off of this list. But LinkedIn is getting in the game now, Facebook obviously, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, things like TripAdvisor, which is a ton of reviews, things of that nature. Medium, which is a new blog platform. If you look at companies that have really kind of fallen off and coming in, this list is much shorter than what it used to be. But I think we're in a position today where we're going to really start to see a little bit of a culling, and also some potential new entries when you look at that list. The last one was TikTok. And we'll talk a little bit about TikTok in this webcast and why you should be looking at it. Food service pros, media destinations. This is one that you should really keep an eye on. This is the 2018 numbers in 2019 here. So print down 4.8, web is up 2.8, social is up 8.3%, and then news apps, the 16% increase that we saw, and then on demand and OTT. That's Netflix, Apple News, Amazon Prime, and the OTT products that you're getting on demand and OTT, up 34.8%. And this is across the demographic that you see above: chef and independents, chains, non-coms, and C&I. So there's a lot of movement in the food service space to really start to shift where they're getting and consuming their content. Engagement platforms. Instagram's still a big player. I'll talk about Instagram in a little bit of why I think that might be a waning platform. YouTube, very, very effective. And then Facebook kind of coming in as the dweller there on engagement in terms of how often chefs and independents are really jumping into. These are the ones that I think are kind of the players moving forward. Amazon is moving up the pack. Netflix, just because of Chef's Table, I think there's been a lot of movement into that, but Netflix is going to really have to commit into more education content to be able to keep the business user, so they're not dealing with kind of that more consumer crowd, which I think Amazon's play is probably going to be going the education route. The next slide here is to talk about top platforms, and this is for engaged chefs and independents by demographic. So you see here the 18 to 24, 25, 34, and so on. The big winner here, if you look across this, really is podcast. It's a big move. You also look at YouTube, another big move. It's just in the younger crowd. It's interesting how podcasts play into the older audience, but also a little bit into the younger audience, where YouTube does not necessarily play into the older audience as much. On demand, growing across younger and middle-aged audiences. When I say middle-aged, meaning 25 to 45. And then areas like Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook, of course, is kind of the one that has the least amount of engagement when you look at what's happening in food service today. So podcasts, definitely moving fast. We are estimating a professional audience in the food service sector at about 2.8 million. This is huge. When you look at Apple, probably hitting around half the chef market out there, who listen to about 2.5 podcasts a week. And then Spotify, of course, which is growing very fast. So these platforms are really on fire. If you do not have a podcast in your array for next year, or if you're not already developing one, you are definitely missing out as a business, because it is one of the best ways. It's also hard to break through the noise, but it is one of the best ways that you can get out to your customers in terms of content and information. Now we're going to talk about cross-connected platforms, and this one is a little bit more complex because this is going to play into a strategy I'll talk a little bit about later in the webcast here. But it's very specific that you have to do these cross connections with custom audiences. And what I mean by that is whether it's your email list, whether it is subscribers that maybe you've done, or your customer list, whatever it might be, that you know who that customer is. Being able to start to cross-connect these in these platforms is going to become very, very critical for your IT and development teams, so that you can start looking at behavior on these platforms based on your actual audience. And that's going to be a killer app as it moves forward. We've been able to do this and start to learn from what's happening out there on the marketplace, and it really helps us in understanding where we should be going with our content and how. Instagram, still a very active platform for brands. You can kind of see the array right here of the brands that are on it. Fast casual at 600 plus, chains 1100, upscale casual, multi-unit independent, and then independents, of course, control, which is really kind of independents control most of the population in food service today. Second most active platform for chefs right now is Instagram at 123,000 chefs in the U.S. alone, or people that call themselves chefs and cooks. So again, a great place for them to kind of move. Here's some methodologies that if you're not already implementing, you should be. This is just an example of a localized outreach and brand advocacy that was done by Mark Voltaggio, who is chef, Voltaggio. And he's kind of, he's one of those that I think uses it the right way. Not very overly promotional, but really all about brand awareness and kind of helping communities. Here's one with Steph Izard in Chicago, a top 100 chef, event marketing collaborations. This is another great method to use it. And then here's one from Chef Adrian Calvo right here in Miami, product testing and consumer feedback right from Instagram. So it's still a very powerful tool, though I do know that Instagram organic reach is falling, and we'll talk about that. We're going to take a quick break, but we will be right back on the next step for where you need to be, and that's the future of content. So stay tuned right here. Has your business hit a wall? Is your competition eating your lunch? I've been building breakthrough brands for over 20 years with experience right from the trenches. We deliver strategy, execution, and follow-through results in branding, technology, operations, marketing, and leadership. Become the breakthrough brand you should be. Contact me now at paulbarrongroup.com. All right, so welcome back to the webcast today. And again, we're really going to get into kind of the future of content, because the next 10 years are going to depend on how well you do content for your business. It doesn't matter if you are a one-man shop or you are a massive billion or multi-billion-dollar corporation. Content will be the key for you to take the next steps in reaching your customer. So let's talk a little about where content is exploding right now. If you look at what's happening on Apple News, and if you think about Apple and what they have been able to do as an ecosystem, this is the perfect example of how a company has taken a small device like the iPhone and created a global phenomenon around connecting directly to the user and their customer base without having to go through pretty much anybody. And they've been able to do this through a tremendous strategic step process that they started with a small thing called the iPhone. And now what you see is 3.4 million estimated food service operators that are in this app, being Apple News. And if you look at the breakdown on video engagement and page views, this is amazing numbers when you compare this to something of a website or something like that. And again, remember that Apple News is, it's a news app in your pocket that's got, 1,500 publishers in it. So all of the content based on the algorithm of how you consume content is being fed to you into that platform. So again, much like what Facebook tried to do with the news feed, much like what Twitter tries to do, with their trending, all of this is happening, but it's native to that device. And that is why I think it has such a unique and very almost nuanced approach to being able to reach these customers of Apple. And why is this important? Because if you're looking to reach all of your customers, you're going to have to do it on the platforms, these native platforms that these major multi-billion-dollar companies are developing. So let's look at reasons for adoption. Native to the Apple ecosystem, pretty much hands down. It's most top publishers are on there. Algorithm-based news, auto updates, linked to social, integrated API partnerships, less and less visits to content on websites. That's a big play. Meaning if you think you're going to get everybody out of their business or what their daily business to come to your business and consume content, unless you're serving food or you've got something dramatically important for those people to get from you, they're going to use the platforms that are easiest for them to use. And if you're not there, you're going to get beat in the next decade. Operators have 2.4 news apps on their mobile devices versus last year at 3.9. So cutting it in half. And I think we'll continue to see consolidation of news and aggregators, especially for apps. So I think those, unless, again, this goes back to the app ecosystem, why I think apps are probably a dead thing. Unless you have a very unique business model, apps are going to go away if you are trying to just deliver a message. We'll go into media insights. Understand how your media can tell a story. Insights to operators and how they react to your media campaigns. Learn what operators are interested in versus your products, and then kind of reveal the engagement demographics. So this is going to be your interest areas, competitive areas, and within your media project. And what I mean by that is a lot of times people will go out, do their project, and never really get the metrics on the back end. All of these platforms enable you to get that kind of data, and that kind of data is going to be very important in your strategy in developing your business in the next decade. Because I'll guarantee you, that has not been used in the last decade. The last decade was spray and pray. This decade is going to be rifle sniper shots right into the demographic, and then you're going to be able to drill down from each individual demographic based on how effective your content and your message was in delivering it. And if you don't believe me in terms of growth, here's a good example of just LinkedIn and where we are dealing with food service. This is food service. Food service, both in LinkedIn and Prime Video. Look at the growth curves that we're seeing all the way out to 2022 here. 2017, 345,000 in LinkedIn. That was a very small amount. Most of it was just and you think about where the growth is coming from, most of that was the old executives that were using LinkedIn as their primary source of a CV or a resume. That has completely shifted because of one reason. The millennial audience has adopted LinkedIn, and you have to look at the size of the millennial audience and then compare the size of the millennial audience in food service. Same thing's happening on Prime Video. 2017 didn't exist. 2018, 239,000 up to what we think is going to be around 3.2 million. That's about a third, or excuse me, about 20% of the overall food service market, where in LinkedIn, you're probably looking at about 40% of the overall food service market, the entire employment base of a $1 trillion industry like food service. So these two platforms are ones that you definitely have to consider in your strategy profile for the future. New platforms for food service pros, estimated 1.1 million Prime members that are food service operators. If you look at this in 2016 out to 2019, and this breaks it down by the type, being chefs, independents, other food service types, non-commercial, beverage pros, etc. This is, I think, just showing you the array of food service that's really starting to look at Prime Video as a great source for content education. Stay on top of that. And then, of course, all that's going to play into commerce. And, of course, Amazon has made major plays into food service commerce, and I think they will continue to do so when you look at the number of transactions that are going to be occurring. This is pretty interesting because it's set to reach over 7.1 million food service operators when it comes to transactions by 2022 for supplies. And this will be everything from dry goods to uniforms, plant-based, specialty, frozen even in some cases. Ingredients and spices is really blowing up in terms of where Amazon's growth is. So in the food service space, and whether you're in B2B, B2C, if you do have products that can start to amplify on Amazon, that is going to be one of the major destinations. And if you think about it, Amazon is actually becoming a major media player, and a lot of people don't know them as a media company. This is going to be a huge opportunity, whether it's through advertising within the Amazon ecosystem, or even though I do think there are some things happening over on Shopify that's kind of cool. I mean, that little Canadian company, I think, has a pretty interesting story in what they're trying to do, but that's more for a B2C and another webcast for sure, to talk about the two platforms and how e-commerce could become, well, it will be the solution depending on your product and your business model for the next decade. All right, so we're going to move into strategies to defend against this disruption. And these are the steps you can take to be able to get prepared for the next 10 years for your business. And this is something that's going to be, I think, one of those things that you really have to make a decision. You have to draw that line in the sand and make the decision. I know a lot of you probably faced this in 2007 when your marketing interns or your junior VP came to you and said, hey, this social media thing, we need to get on it. We need to be in there. And there were a lot of executives that are watching this webcast right now. You probably said, hey, let's step back and watch and see where this goes. Well, where did it go? It went to a lot of places, but the number one thing it did was it consumed the American and the global psyche in how technology was being accepted by consumers and business professionals alike. So if you're making that same decision today, these are the steps you're going to have to take. So let's talk about Strategy 2020. Digital takes over the marketing budget. I hear this more and more from agencies, PR, you name it, is that, oh, our brands, our customers, they're trying to get into digital, they're trying to go in this direction. If they're trying to do it now in 2020, they might as well just hang it up, because they're never going to be best in class in their category unless they absolutely overspend and then the value proposition goes away anyway. So if you are not already moving in the direction of 100% digital budget, you are on the downside of every one of your competitors that are. Because the ones who have taken it to the next game level, they're the ones that are winning. They are completely shattering and leading out as the number one category leader. And I can name companies, when you look at someone like a Sweetgreen to a Nike, all of these companies are looking at how to move to the next level. Beyond Meat, if you want to look at that one. You can go, I can name you a dozen different companies that are moving in this category, and they're doing it at a pace in which they're literally dedicating their entire marketing budget to digital. Advertising begins its death walk. This is the one that always scares everybody because we're a media company, but at the same time, we're also an education platform. Foodable is about education and about connecting the dots for operators or companies out there. Paul Barron Group is about helping companies move to that next level, education-wise. Advertising, and when you look at Foodable, we dropped the idea of advertising per se many years ago. The idea of advertising, sure, we still get banner ads and email requests all the time because of our audience. But the fact is that most of advertising, as you know it, as we know it, is on its death walk right now, and it's just absolutely going away. It will be content and story, and that's the only thing that will matter in the future. And the one that has the best content and story and develops brand is going to be the win. That's the companies that will win out in the next decade. SEO and email focus, that's going to come back to a discipline that you and your businesses have to be able to address, because email still is going to be a big winner when it comes to being able to directly connect with your audience. And I'll talk about how that strategy is going to play in to something you should be doing. Audience migration. This is where you've got to start moving your audiences off these platforms. So you use these platforms as best you can. You literally milk them as far as you can, trying to move as much audience as you can onto your own platform. Now, your platform has to be robust, because they're not going to leave one to come to yours if you're over there and you just have a blog and you post every once in a while. Or you have a YouTube channel that has 100 subs and you post no video content, or a Twitter feed. You get the picture. The idea is you have to reconnect how digital is being magnified, and that means it's going to take a lot of your budget to do so. Library development, this is another big fail of most companies. They don't build library. They're not looking long term. If, like what we do, library is the future, because it is going to be the migration. Because remember, we put out this webcast today for 100 viewers, 1,000 viewers, whatever the audience might be. But this webcast is going to be able to help tens of thousands down the road. Possibly a university that's probably watching this 5 years from today. I see you in the crowd out there right now. That's why library matters. It's why companies like Disney are developing their own platforms. It's why Apple has put so much money into content. It's why Netflix and Amazon, all these companies know the battle is about to begin, and it's happening in B2B as well. Custom audience development, this is where you have to learn how to build your custom audience around your existing customers and where you are drawing your existing customers from. That could be conferences, trade shows, whatever it might be that you are bringing in those existing customers or that existing audience and being able to reach them. And then looking at syndication, and I know this is kind of an unusual idea for most of you, but your content is worth something. And it's very possible that you might be able to do a syndication deal, maybe with a company like us or other companies that can get your content out there. And again, magnifying goes back to something we talked about early in the webcast, and that is content amplification. And then the last one is forget the app ecosystem. I really feel if you are not a major player that offers something so unique and so amazing, if you just have a product or a service, I just don't see an app being the vehicle for you. What you have to do is ride the waves of the platforms, drawing in as many customers and partners and connection points as you can from each one of those platforms and combining them into your own platform that can become something that is not necessarily an app. Now, you could be evolving to an app if you're robust enough, and I'll talk about that. So let's talk about organic reach. Now, organic reach has been a big deal on Instagram. It's kind of what grew the business from when Kevin Systrom started Instagram years ago, before they were acquired by Facebook. And organic was the winner. It's how all of these Instagram famous people became a thing. It's how Instagram killed Vine, if you've ever heard of it. It's how Instagram became one of the most used platforms by business professionals that are in the creative spaces, such as food service. So this is the part that kind of scares me the most about Instagram, is you can go out there and spend a ton of time and money, maybe a decade, on building a presence on Instagram or any of these platforms. But the one thing you have to do is you have to be ready to scale and go at speed when a platform takes off. And you have to, at the same time, be prepared for if it does not, that all that was for nothing. And I know that's a big risk, but you take it every day in business, so don't say you don't. You might put a product out there that you don't know if it's gonna make it or not. It's a risk. It's a business risk that you're willing to take. It's an educated analysis that you've taken on the market and what you think needs it. It's the same thing in the platforms. You have to be able to develop an understanding of how to accelerate. But the minute that you jump onto a platform, you've got to be able to accelerate at speed in terms of how content is moving. So let's talk about those two elements: more content library creation, create variations of your content for different platforms if you're not already. Consumption increases based on repurposing that content, again, being able to use it in multiple areas. And I think that is what's going to take us into the next layer, and that is podcasts. Now, why is Apple and Spotify so important in B2B in the future? The reason is very simple. These two companies have amassed, when you look at the one-to-one equation of education or awareness, these are probably the two companies that have been able to successfully amass the most people on the planet. That's the entire planet. And these are the platforms that are going to take us to the next level. Now, Spotify is an interesting one because they rely on something that's very unique, and that's an app. They have to ride in the app ecosystem, both on Apple and on Android, so Google Play. So they're a little bit at a disadvantage. I think this is going to be something, because mobile has just pretty much taken over in terms of content consumption for podcasts. It'll be interesting to see how this plays out. And I don't necessarily think Apple's going to be the only player, but they're definitely the biggest player right now when it comes to podcasts. So here's distributed content strategy. Audio consumption has increased 83% in the past year. 70% of Americans have heard a podcast. 51% of Americans 12 or older have listened. That's 12 or over have listened to podcasts. This is an insane number for a product that really only hit mainstream less than 3 years ago. That is a massive uptick. I remember when we launched our first podcast in 2006 or 7, I believe it was, and it was crickets. There was, you might have 100 listeners at most, and there was 5 podcasts in the entire category. Now there's 500 to 5,000 podcasts in a category. That's the difference in how this is moving, and this has completely taken over the radio world and ecosystem of where audio is going to be listened to. So this is a good example of how we went in, being Foodable, and really kind of dominated the food service space, now with the largest podcast network in food service. Really going across what is all of the different platforms out here, giving our content away on our website, but also utilizing all the platforms to be able to distribute that content. And if you look at these, Apple Podcasts, Google Play, TuneIn, iHeart, and Spotify, and now you can find our podcast, The Barron Report, on Alexa. So if you're listening to this podcast and you have an Alexa nearby, Alexa, play the Barron Report podcast, and you'll get a chance to listen to it right there. This is important. If you're moving into the next decade and you're not moving around podcasts, this is where you're going to have a fail. Let's also talk about a new platform strategy. And this is where if you look at something like a TikTok, and this is a good example right here that's on screen. If you don't know Gary Vee, I'm assuming you do. If you're listening to this webcast or watching this webcast, you know who this guy is. He's one of the innovators of digital. He also launched Wine Library TV. It was his claim to fame. This guy did 1,000 episodes of Wine Library TV with a camcorder, and essentially built a following that was and is now, probably close to $1 billion company. But he's done it through building on reputation, and he preps his content to apply to the audience he's moving to. And if you ever watch any of his videos or listen to his podcasts, you'll quickly understand what I'm talking about there. But he also does something that you need to do, and that is he tests new platforms, and he's prepared to spend years on it, meaning long plays. And I know about long plays. You have to be able to see a move or a curve that's occurring, put it out there, and not quit on it until it's just not there. And that is the factor that you have to be willing to lose it all. So it's a big deal. Platforms for B2B, LinkedIn and YouTube, both are on fire. Instagram and Twitter still viable to 2021, I think. And Facebook, I'm still a little bit out on that in terms of where the growth will be. TikTok is definitely the rising star. I know a lot of you will say, TikTok, that's really not our generation, it's not our audience. But I want you to understand something. Probably when you looked at Instagram, it was the same way. And maybe even when you looked at Twitter 10 years ago, it was the same way. It was the young kids, it was the influencers, it was the people, the early adopters that you weren't sure would meet your audience demographic. Remember this, is that all these platforms age up, number one, and Gen Z is an audience that is super important in this next decade. You think the millennials were important? Gen Z is going to be a huge audience that's important, and the places you're going to find them, whether it's on understanding brand awareness and making sure they know who your brand is so they can go out and ask mom and dad, making sure they understand what kind of products that you have. If you are a champion for social good, this is where all of that's going to occur, is in platforms like TikTok. So don't push that one away. I want you to really consider it. Let's go how to start. Understand your story. This is a very important thing. A lot of people think they understand their story, but maybe they really don't. They don't really understand what they are about when it comes to digital. Because digital has to transform your story in ways that are a bit different. And the way I always say this is, if you imagine trying to tell your story in a PowerPoint, that's not the story you want to tell on digital. Digital has to be that conversation that you have with a friend about your business. So it goes much more contextual, and it has a lot more play in it. It's a lot looser in its definition, and it just feels more natural. And I think that is a thing that storytelling starts to do versus, and I see this mistake happen all the time with our own partners, is that they get so corporate or so dialed into what they think they should look like, instead of dialing into the message that they should be giving to their customers. And that's where understanding your story is going to be huge. Identify your key audience. Could be someone you don't even know. That means your emerging audience, your missed audience, people you don't even know you're hitting yet. Those can start to show up in your demographics and your metrics as you start to look at these platform data points. Know that platforms will change, and be prepared to move your library of content and make it transportable so you can shift it to a new platform as quick as possible, and then restart redeveloping a new platform where you can potentially connect to a whole new audience and start building your audience. So that brings me to one of the biggest strategies that you should be doing for this next decade, and that is called platform harvesting, the secret weapon for the disruption decade. If you see all of these company logos and icons up there, essentially what these are places where people gather. It's where they consume information and content and education and all these things. You've got to learn how to start to target these audiences, whether they're with pixels or tracking APIs or some kind of partnership connection within them, and be able to start to harvest that audience into something for you. Now, again, remember, if you don't have a big enough deal to be able to bring that audience over to you, it's not the time to harvest. What you've got to do is pour your content into those platforms and rely on those platforms until you're ready to harvest, but be ready to do it. Content marketing capture, that's going to be a big play. Again, things like Webcast, like what we're doing right here, special series, information, education programs, podcasts, special interviews, you can name it. And you've probably got the ability to migrate some of that audience over on a one-to-one basis in dealing with that. And then retargeting via email and social. Those are going to be major strategies in the future in how you're marketing and utilizing technology to be able to really zero in on where your advertising dollars are going. And the last but not least is deliver to your own platform. So when you look at this slide here, the delivering to your own platforms is really kind of the next phase in your strategy for the next decade. And what I mean by that is this. So this is a company that has taken the step, and they're going in the right direction of developing their own platform of content. Now, of course, they use and license content from Foodable to keep that and bolster it up while it's in its process of building. And that's a great strategy to move into. But now, once that you've created that critical mass, enough content features there, or information features, education features, that's where your play will begin to stay. So if you look at the feature list right here, video and podcast education platform, research and content library. This is important. Research can become a piece of content for you. Profile targeting. This is getting back to when you're bringing a user over from Facebook, Twitter, or any of these other platforms. Now you can start understanding what kind of profile they're developing on your own platform. Engagement and behavior analytics. You don't get that. You don't get down to the user analytics on any other platform than your own. And then what's trending analytics, being able what's hot. Again, you're getting something out on a platform like Instagram or Twitter or some of that nature. That's trending on their platform, but it's not necessarily trending for you. Member-based engagement, this gets back into where it's a one-to-one conversation for you, and then it's direct to consumer. And this can happen in a B2B space, in a B2C space. We do this, we walk the walk with this because we have Foodable On Demand. It's the exact same platform that you saw right there that is designed to develop content gatherers and harvesting over a long period of time. So as you're building your plan for the disruption decade, these are the things that you really have to look at. And I'll leave with a couple of things. We're going to have the PDF for this entire webcast available to you, so don't worry, you'll get a copy of this. But I want you to consider as you look forward is that the changes really have to occur at the core of your business. And if you're not already there in terms of really committing to digital, then that's really the first step you have to take. You have to maybe take a weekend and go out and really think about what you as a business leader are trying to do with your business on a day in, day out basis. And you've got to come to that realization that the next decade is going to change everything we've ever known. You think we've seen change in the last 10 years. The things that are happening right now is a perfect storm for what could be, and this isn't even counting a recession hitting. But the things that are happening right now, with all the technology, social impact that we are having within our society, digital is going to be a paramount step in your next move for the next 10 years of growth for your business. So I don't want you to miss that. The last is going to be, don't miss my book. This is important. The Disruption Decade will be out next year. It's coming in, hopefully by May, you'll have it. You can visit this slide right here, which is paulbarrongroup.com/disrupt. And that is going to give you the blueprint for business to address the shift in the digital consumer demand over the next decade. Stay tuned right here. If you are not checking out more of our great content, just visit, of course, FuboTV.com. And also you can catch a lot of content like this over on Paul Barron Group, including webcasts like this. We have, as I said, 6 chapters in this entire series that we'll be doing over time. And we'll really start boiling down into the individual elements of what you should be doing step by step by category. Everything from content marketing to mobile, being able to look at how you're building your infrastructure and your teams, and then also looking at platforms and what the best strategies and best practices will be for the future. So stay tuned right here on topics for that. Hopefully this webcast has been a good one for you. If you have any questions, and we haven't been able to maybe hit them in the comments or be able to direct them, just send us an email. And you can do that to paul@pbg2.com. We'll catch you soon. Take care.